Biblioteka plus. Zadatak ovog foruma je da okupi domaće i inostrane stručnjake i ponudi delotvoran susret struke sa najnovijim teorijskim i praktičnim iskustvima uz istovremeno promišljanje sopstvenih pozicija i mogućnosti za rešavanje uočenih problema. U tome će nam, pored vas, danas pomoći i Ričard Ruk, profesor Berlinske škole ekonomije i prava, autor knjige Evropski mediji u digitalnom dobu, na kojoj se i zasniva program ovog današnjeg foruma, potom Miroljub Radojković, profesor Fakulteta političkih nauka, zatim Rade Veljanovski, takođe profesor Fakulteta političkih nauka, Dragan Janjić iz Nezavisnog udruženja novinara Srbije i Vladan Joler iz Share fondacije. Jelena Surčulija Milojević, koja je bila najavljena u programu, nažalost neće danas moći da bude sa nama. Današnji skup predstavlja prvi deo foruma. Nastavak nas očekuje već 8. aprila, kada ćemo razgovarati o medijskoj pismenosti, a gost će nam biti Endi Radok, autor knjige Mladi i mediji, i možete u narednom periodu očekivati obaveštenja u vezi sa skupom koji nas očekuje. Ovu priliku bih iskoristila i da se zahvalim Ministarstvu kulture i informisanja, kao i misiji OEBS-a u Srbiji, koji su nam pružili podršku prilikom organizacije foruma Mediji u Srbiji u digitalnom dobu. Na početku skupa pozdravit će vas Saša Mirković, državni sekretar za medije u Ministarstvu kulture i informisanja, zatim Gordana Janković, šefica odeljenja za medije misije OEBS-a u Srbiji, i Zoran Hamović, glavni urednik iz Zavačkog preduzeća Clio i osnivač udruženja Biblioteka plus. Gospodine Mirkoviću.
Hvala, dobar dan. Poštovane dame i gospodo, koleginice i kolege, veliko mi je zadovoljstvo da danas budem sa vama u Medija centru na početku ovog programa i na otvaranju foruma koji je podržan od strane komisije koja je formirana pri Ministarstvu kulture i informisanja u okviru sekcije koja je na osnovu Zakona o javnom informisanju i medijima prvi put počela da funkcioniše prošle godine. U pitanju je projektno sufinansiranje programa kojima se podižu etički i profesionalni standardi u novinarstvu, kao i edukacija i organizacija ovakvih i sličnih skupova. I eto, zanimljivo je da je ove nedelje objavljen konkurs Ministarstva kulture i informisanja za ovu godinu. Suma koja je izdvojena za 6 kategorija je veća nego prošle godine i iznosi ukupno 262 miliona dinara, što učvršćuje Ministarstvo kulture i informisanja na mesto najvećeg pojedinačnog donatora u sferi finansiranja, odnosno sufinansiranja projektnih sadržaja koji čuvaju i promovišu javni interes u medijima. Ono što je takođe bitno reći jeste da se mi svakodnevno imamo priliku da vidimo i da pratimo koliko su uspešni projekti koji su podržani od strane Ministarstva kulture i informisanja i Vlade Republike Srbije na osnovu odluka stručnih komisija. I evo, još uvek sam pod utiskom serijala koji je juče počeo da se emituje na televiziji Prva o maloletničkoj delikvenciji koji je uradila produkcijska kuća Brandon, kojom rukovodi Bojana Lekić. Bio sam zaista vrlo zadovoljan kada sam video krajnji rezultat, a naročito kada sam video u odjednoj špici da je pomenuto da je Ministarstvo kulture i informisanja podržalo ovakve sadržaje. Mislim da treba da ih bude što je moguće više i mislim da je potrebno da budu dostupni što je moguće većoj auditorijumu i populaciji. I u tom smislu mislim da je jako bitno podržavati i ovakve projekte i teme kao što je promocija ove knjige i teme koje se tiče medija u digitalnom dobu. Naime, vi sami znate da je medijska strategija koja je doneta 2011. godine do 2016. godine definisala niz stvari koje treba preduzeti u medijskoj sferi i zakonodavni okvir koji je trebalo unaprediti je upotpunjen pre par nedelja donošenjem zakona o oglašavanju koji je u resoru Ministarstva trgovine, turizma i telekomunikacija. i na taj način se negde logično otvorio put ka izradi i nove medijske strategije koje će uslediti u ovoj godini. Ta medijska strategija bi sasvim sigurno trebala mnogo više da se bavi medijima u digitalnom dobu nego što je to činila ova strategija od 2011. do 2016. godine. I sami su svesni koliko se stvari promenile, koliko su promene česte. Svesni smo da često zakonodavni okvir ne uspeva da prati promene koje se događaju u sferi medija u digitalnom dobu, a isto tako svi znamo koliko se toga promenilo od 17. juna prošle godine, kada je došlo do digitalizacije TV signala, koje su sve mogućnosti, koje čini mi se još uvek nisu iskorišćene, otvorene, i mislim da ćemo tek u ovoj narednoj godini videti koje sve mogućnosti nam daje digitalizacija TV signala i sve ono što može da dovede do konvergencije samih medija na različite platforme i sadržaje koje oni mogu da pružaju. Ono što takođe želim da kažem jeste da je dobro da izrada medijske strategije koincidira sa početkom otvaranja pregovora. Mi se nadamo da će i poglavlje 10, koje se odnosi na medije i informaciono društvo, biti u neko dogledno doba otvoreno, što će otvoriti put za još bolju primenu te nove medijske strategije, za izmenu zakona, za donošenje novih zakona, sve u skladu sa izazovima vremena koje sledi, jer uvek volim da podsjetim da su dosadašnja i sadašnja zakonska rešenja zapravo neka vrsta hvatanja koraka sa onim što smo propustili činjenicom da 11 godina nije bilo novih zakona i da zapravo sada treba da usavršimo ono što je doneto u 2014. godini. U svakom slučaju mislim da su ovakvi skupovi od izuzetne koristi. Mislim da je, ohrabrilo me podatak koji sam čuo da će 8. aprila biti još jedna sesija organizovana, sada posvećena medijskoj pismenosti. Mislim da je to izuzetno značajno i da medijska pismenost u budućoj medijskoj strategiji treba da ima mnogo veći prostor i da je upravo medijska pismenost jedna od ključnih elemenata za razumevanje medija, za razumevanje sadržaja i za edukaciju mladih generacija koje treba da još bolje razumeju prirodu medija u ovom digitalnom dobu. Još jednom vam se zahvaljujem na pažnji i želim vam uspešan i plodotvoran skup. Hvala.
Hvala gospodine Mirkoviću. Gospođo Janković.
Dame i gospodo, poštovane koleginice i kolege, i meni je kao i Saši zadovoljstvo da budem danas ovde sa vama. Svet je izmenjen do neprepoznatljivosti pod uticajem tehnologije. Kažu da većina nas u svojim mobilnim telefonima i tabletima ima napredniju tehnologiju sada nego prvi ljudi na mesecu. Svaki dan se krećemo i radimo u okruženju koje je potpuno drugačije od onog od pre samo 20 godina. Tehnologija ima sve veći uticaj i na društveni razvoj, obrazovanje i ekonomiju i u Srbiji. Televizija je uspešno i u roku digitalizovana 2015. Sada u 2016. Ministarstvo trgovine, turizma i telekomunikacije, kako je Saša pomenuo, radi na unapređivanju infrastrukture u obrazovnim osnovnoškolskim institucijama. Online bankarstvo je sve prisutnije, razvija se online biznis, razvija se elektronska uprava, elektronska trgovina. Da bi se koristile prednosti novog načina komunikacije, ali i da bi se građani pravovremeno zaštitili od mogućih online zloupotreba, zahtev za digitalno opismenjavanje stanovništva mora da bude prioritet kako institucijama države, tako i institucijama civilnog društva. Mediji kao institucije informisanja i obrazovanja takođe igraju značajnu ulogu u ovom procesu. Novinarske redakcije danas izgledaju sasvim drugačije, informacije stižu sa samo nekoliko minuta zakašnjenja u odnosu na događaj, građani vrše direktne prenose i sami aktivno učestvuju u procesu informisanja. Izbor jezika na kome se prati program značajno menja formate u multilingvalnom informisanju. Nadam se da će nas i naš gost, profesor Ričard Ruk, kroz svoje predavanje inspirisati za rad na daljim promenama naših praksi. Posebno se zahvaljujem organizaciji Biblioteka Plus i izdavačkoj kući Clio, sa kojima sarađujemo kroz projekte digitalne i medijske pismenosti, zato što su prepoznali važnost medijske literature za obrazovanje u digitalnom dobu i čine tu literaturu dostupnom našim građanima. Drago mi je da danas ovde vidim mnoge stručnjake za obrazovanje i nešto mladih, ne koliko smo se nadali, sa obzirom da je školska učionica još jedna od retkih stvari koje nedovoljno koristi digitalno okruženje i to će se, nadam se, menjati. Nadamo se da će pritisak i potrebe za razvojem uskoro dovesti do promena u obrazovanju. Misija OEBS-a ostaje spremna da pomogne i medijima i inicijativama u medijskom i digitalnom obrazovanju kako države, tako i civilnog društva, da bi se našli što bolji odgovori u svetu koji donosi nova tehnologija. Želim vam uspešan skup i neću dalje da vas zadržavam.
Hvala vam, gospođo Janković. Gospodine Hamoviću.
Poštovane dame i gospodo, drage kolege, koleginice i kolege, moram da kažem da je 2016. godina zapravo 20. godina, tako reći jubilarna godina u kojoj se rađaju knjige u ediciji multimedija. 96. godine u vreme protesta, pre svega studentskog, a posle i građanskog, mi smo pripremali knjigu koja se zove Moć medija. U tom trenutku nismo sasvim tačno mogli da odredimo šta je ono što nas čeka, ali smo jednu stvar znali, da u vreme turbulentnih društvenih okolnosti posle pada Berlinskog zida jedna stvar uvek može da bude prepoznata kao važna, a to je sticanje novih znanja, posebno u onoj sili koja je u tom trenutku sasvim jasno bila određena, a to je ono što je u medijima, dakle, informisanje. Objavljivanjem te prve knjige Francisa Bala mi smo započeli zapravo onu avanturu i do dana današnjeg ostali vrlo odani toj ideji da se brinemo o onome što se danas i popularno i trendi zove medijska pismenost. Zapravo bavili smo se nečim drugim, reč je o medijskoj kulturi. I jedna od prvih zamisli jeste bila da se medijska kultura uvede tamo gde joj jeste zaista mesto i gde ima neku vrstu građanske relevantnosti i potrebe, a to su škole. Ako vam kažem da smo posle 10 godina objavili ovu knjigu kao jednu vrstu svedočanstva ili preseka tih napora i te nade da će se medijska kultura useliti na ovaj ili onaj način kao formalno ili neformalno obrazovanje u naše škole, ja mogu da kažem da te nade nisu izneverene, odnosno nisu sasvim, ali svakako da ne možemo biti zadovoljni onim što se danas čini u školama na tom veoma važnom zadatku. Postoje strategije, postoje planovi, postoje razmišljanja, postoje uverenja koja se i dalje šire, ali mi do dana današnjeg nismo zapravo došli u situaciju da kažemo da imamo medijsko obrazovanje u školama. Stoga mogu da kažem da smo pokušali ovom edicijom, dakle, knjigama koje smo pre svega objavljivali prevodeći različita strana iskustva u onoj oblasti koja nama nije bila sasvim dostupna. Stvorili smo jednu platformu koja je bila korisna pre svega za medijske poslenike, dakle one koji su već u medijskom pogonu, u medijskim preduzećima, zatim istraživačima kojima je bilo potrebno da imaju jednu vrstu literature na koju mogu da se oslone i na sopstvenom jeziku, da bismo zapravo najviše pažnje poklonili mladim ljudima, pre svega u srednjim školama i njihovim profesorima, pre svega onima koji predaju građansko vaspitanje, jer je to bila njihova neposredna dužnost, da se oslone na kvalitetnu literaturu i da za sebe raščiste pojmove koji su im potrebni da bi mogli svakodnevno da obavljaju posao koji im je poveren. To su, dakle, bili to su bile naše želje i to smo u proteklih 20 godina, rekao bih, ispunili. Kako, to vi, pretpostavljam, bolje možete da ocenite i znate, ali ono što jeste važno je da nastavljamo taj posao i da ćemo se i dalje truditi da doprinosimo kvalitetnom literaturom, odnosno njenim izborom i autorima. Jedan od njih nesumnjivo sedi danas sa nama. Njegovu dobru volju i njegovo znanje imate priliku da iskoristite. Želim vam danas srećan i ugodan rad i da ono što profesor Ruk bude kazao na izvestan način iskoristimo svi zajedno da unapredimo ambijent u kome živimo. On nije samo medijski, on je ambijent koji zahteva mnogo reformativnih poteza, ali ne svakako onih koji nam dolaze sa vrha, koji proglašavaju reformu, ali ja u bajke ne verujem. Ja se zalažem za neke druge reforme i na svu sreću dolaze izbori, pa ćemo onda dati svoj glas pravim reformama. Hvala vam.
Zahvaljujem se organizatorima na pozdravnoj reči. U prvom delu foruma nas očekuje predavanje profesora Ričarda Ruka. Nakon toga predviđeno je vreme za pitanja i komentare učesnika. Podsjećam vas još jednom da je obezbeđen simultani prevod i svim onima kojima su potrebne mogu da se posluže slušalicama koje stoje na stolu sa vaše leve strane, a komunikacija će se odvijati na srpskom i na engleskom jeziku. Professor Ruk, welcome. Please begin.
Well, dear colleagues, Secretary of State, CLIO colleagues from colleges across ex-Yugoslavia and across the whole of the Balkans. It's a great pleasure for me to be here. I feel honored. Honored in many ways because my work has been, in a sense, recognized by you, and that in itself is a considerable pleasure. Whether I'm the genius people might say I am, I doubt. All I have done is tried to follow the world of the media on a personal level just as much as it is a professional level. My wife is a journalist of 30 years. She's worked for the BBC for 20, and so I have lived the nature of broadcasting financially, emotionally, and familiarly considerably. And I would start off by saying we live in troubled times. But equally, we live in times of great opportunity. And so if I have any message to my colleagues here, no matter the disturbances you are going through, and you are not alone, the media is being disturbed everywhere. The technical word, or the fashionable word, is disruption. The technology associated with the media is going through, in the 21st century, starts in the 1980s, 1990s, is going through a fundamental revolution which will change everything. Not just media, everything. Because it touches the very nature of the way in which we communicate with each other. And so it touches literature and culture and education and the way in which we group ourselves, which is both virtual and non-virtual. We live in very challenging times for organizations that have a history, but we also live in times which, it seems to me, are full of opportunity. And particularly the younger generation know this much more than, say, some of us who have passed our mid-age. And I include myself amongst that. My children. Okay, I'll try and get nearer to the microphone. Is that a bit better? My apologies.
It's okay.
Is that better? Okay. There. I do have a soft voice. You can imagine what the translators have to put up with. And I also speak quite fast, so my apologies for not speaking in Serbian. My German is poor, my French is very good, but my Serbo-Croat is not very good at all. Yes, the study of the media. In many ways, I started my own career by my PhD scholarship in France, where I was very interested in the 1980s with the development of new newspapers. In particular, I worked on the creation of a new newspaper called Libération, which was full of ideas, philosophically and in techniques and the way in which it worked. And that's what I published my PhD work on. And then I married a journalist, and I realized that I'd been much too theoretical about my particular approach. And so the book, which has been so kindly and very well translated by Clio, this is the original in 2009 in the English version, came out of frustration. I was looking at my colleagues and what my colleagues were writing about, and they were more philosophers than they were people who understood the media or the communication in society. And much more it was about discourse analysis or the history of culture and so on, all of which is terribly important. But I saw day to day how programs were put together, how they were thrown out, how nasty editors could be, how there was no money, you could never get an idea pushed forward. And I thought, nobody's writing about this. And so I kind of looked at those who were writing about it, and I noticed that there was something missing. Nobody was talking about the money. Where did the money come from to support the very nature of media and kind of culture? And very few people were dealing with the economics of the media. They wanted to deal with the public and private kind of debate, but they didn't want to talk about the effective use of allocation of resources in any kind of way. There were two people who I was reading at the time who impressed me considerably, both of whom have just recently retired, and I am indebted to their work. One was he won't mind me saying this, a very large Texan called Robert Picard, who in the end became head of the Reuters Institute in Oxford University in the UK. And what he started writing about was the economics of local newspapers. And it fired me up, because he was beginning to say in the 1970s and 80s, in America, the American newspapers were monopolies within the different states, and that the financial model that was keeping them going was very precarious and fragile. He forecasted that the printed newspaper as he knew it was about to die, and he was right. The other person was André Lange, who was a part of the European Commission, who set up a European Audiovisual Observatory, which the ministry here and most of us in the business will use. It's now part of the Council of Europe. It's transferred its responsibilities. But it was led by a Belgian, André Lange, who said, what we need is data. Instead of just philosophizing about what's going on, we need to know how many companies, how many public, how many private, what kind of programs are going on, who's watching it. He started connecting production to consumers, and he was right. So I put the two things together, and the result was this particular book. Now I'm going to break a rule. At my age, I'm allowed to break rules, is to quote from my own book, 2009. I've never done this before in public, quote from my own work, and you have it in translation anyway. But this was written in between 2007 and 2009. There is so much change at present that some ask whether a new model, a new paradigm of the media in present-day societies is being born. In some quarters, this is strongly argued, people like McQuail. This is not just about the EU or Europe. It may be applied to other regional blocs. And I was thinking of the time, China, I was thinking India, I was thinking America, and so on. As such, the EU, though, is an example, is representative of how a relatively rich, culturally intricate and politically diverse form of society is coming to grips with new technological media developments in their own singular transnational way. I haven't changed my mind at all. Not in the last 7 or 8 years at least. And you might be very interested that this book has now become part of the Routledge series in the UK, of which I'm quite proud. It's one of the leading intellectual publishing houses in the UK. And I'm in negotiation to do a second edition. But they're beginning to publish works which are like this. And this is what they're called. Public Service Media, Corporate Approach. Does the public sector have any relevance? Question mark. 2015. That's by Raymond Kuhn down at Roehampton. There's another book by Jay Trappel, which is talking about European media in crisis, values, risks and policies, 2015, just published. Interreactive digital narrative, history, theory and practice, how the discourse is being changed by the digital world, published 2015. And in 2014, how in the Netherlands, radio audiences have become completely digital and don't listen to radio waves anymore, 2014. The debate has not moved on since 2009, and you can see my colleagues doing it. So all praise to Clio for picking up a book which was going to, in a sense, lead this kind of direction. I am aware that the screens are quite small and some of my slides are quite complicated, but I'll make simplified verbal versions of them as I go through. My brief today was to, in a sense, update my approach. I've said that in many respects I have not changed my mind, but in one way I have. And if I get the contract for the second edition, I want to talk specifically not just about the digital media in society. I want to talk about the digital revolution in totality, of which the media is a part. It was this very famous diagram by Michael Porter, you can see on the screen, which started giving me ideas about how to approach the subject of the media. Because living in the world of journalism, most journalists think that the media is about journalists. It isn't. It's about those who produce it, the influences on the production, the distribution networks, whether it be a lorry with the newspaper print in the back of the van, or whether it comes through a broadband connection or an internet. And certainly it has something to do with the consumption. And Michael Porter was the economics at MIT and Harvard who started saying that capitalism as we understood it was not simple. It was broken down into processes. And this was his very famous diagram, in which he was trying to say it starts off being produced and you have to have the resources, you have to have the people, you have to have the product, you measure it, you link it all together, and in the end you come up with a product. But the product is not the end. It is how it's consumed which makes it important. Now, as an economist, Michael Porter was talking about money. He was talking about profit, and he was talking about investment. And I came to realize that if we were going to do comparative work in looking at different societies, that you could use this process from production to consumption. And he called it the value chain. And I said, the values of what? It's not just about money, it's about politics, it's about society, it's about how people join together and how they communicate with each other. And that explains the diversity you will find in media. There still is today this idea, coming from people like Marshall McLuhan, that somehow or other the media will make a global village. And we're all going to be the same. We're all going to be the same on Facebook. We're going to be watching the same programs. Not true. If you look today, even with all the technical revolutions, you'll find diversity. And my thanks go out to Montenegro last year for inviting me and allowing me to publish my ideas about this nature of diversity. And I have colleagues there which I value. So here was Porter talking about values, and I realized I could use it in some kind of way to make comparative work in different contexts. And those contexts were, the easy word is globalization. It's one I don't quite understand because it's so diverse in the way in which it works that you can't call it one thing in any particular kind of way. But it's useful to categorize it into international, national, regional, public, private. And these are the kind of debates that are going on. And I'm going to later on talk about a phenomenon which I don't think you've yet heard of, or at least seen unless you've come out of the borders of Serbia, and that's Netflix.
We have it in Serbia as well.
You have now, good. I'm going to talk about what's happening with Netflix, which I'll put into the second edition, which is disturbing everyone in the business. But not Netflix. It now, in video demand, occupies 66% of the global market. Say those figures again, that Netflix in entertainment terms occupies the video on demand by subscription 66% of the market. There are other players, as you know, Amazon, or there is Apple coming on with Apple TV. There is Google and Google TV and other connections. But Netflix is phenomenal, and I want to talk about that. And I didn't talk about it in my book in the first place. Why? Because it didn't exist then. That's new, a new phenomenon. So that, to a certain extent, explains my book and my brief today, which is to try to update what I think. But I want to come back, if you like, in looking to the future, to the technology itself. Interesting that you have now gone over to the digital changeover in 2015. Britain went over this 8 years ago, and the effect has been enormous, even in the UK, even in public broadcasters as big and as important as the BBC. I know it's about relative terms and money, but remember, through tax and licensing fees, the BBC as a public broadcaster spends 3.9 billion euros a year. And that's how big the BBC is. And the BBC is in crisis. Its newsroom is just about to sack another 80 journalists. Last year it sacked 200 journalists. It's converging its newsrooms between radio, television and international radio into one particular form. It doesn't know where it's coming its money from. It's lost all its sport on its TV as they've sold it off to private sector. Even a large organization like the BBC is affected by the digital age. And they're trying desperately to work through that. I know all this from the inside, not just as something being reported. Certainly the digital age has altered profoundly the media technology of the past, where we used to have the print runs, or where we used to have cameras, where we used to have the books in the library. This is now converging into a world of text which is often freely available. 50% of American academic publishing is now, quote, free online. And there's been a movement to allow this to happen. That has meant the financial models associated with that have had to alter. And that's why I'm so pleased to be sitting on the same desk with a librarian who knows the business. And this is coming your way. Now that can be a disaster about knowledge and text and language. It could also be a massive opportunity to provide easier access to a vast range of work at every level, from primary school to university and research. And the Americans have picked up on this. The Western and Eastern Europe have begun to pick up on this a great deal, and it will come down to, it seems to me, Southeast Europe as well, and I include you amongst that list. So, as I move on to something a little bit more technical, as a way we can sum up so far to say that digital products on the internet, and it's not just media, have touched and will touch everything. Amazon, for example, which is a delivery system coming out of America again, is soon to deliver my food bill and my food box within 2 hours whenever I want it. And the vast array of goods that I can buy my food from are enormous. This will change the very nature of the way in which shoppers are going to change. If you look at the figures of those who are buying online, for example, what will happen to your town centres, your cities, when the retail sector is so challenged by higher quality, lower priced goods as is being provided by these kind of organisations, let alone the media itself, which will have to think about the content and the way in which we actually have to function. The European Union knows this. Now, I don't want to get, again, into the politics of the EU, which is having a bit of a bad time at the moment. They've got Brexit. They've got worries about Greece and Brexit. The migrant crisis is creating nothing but division and separation. But do I actually think it's going to die? No. Quite simply because it has the European single market. It is the biggest market in the world. It has the biggest resources financially, bigger than the United States, and its potential in GDP and GDP per capita is enormous. This is a period of cold age for it, in which it's going through various difficulties. And a part of that, of course, they have a digital single market media policy, which has come through the Television Without Borders to the Audiovisual Directive and the way in which it's working, and of which Serbia, of course, is beginning to respond to. But it's bigger than that the European Union is saying that the digital age is more than just media or communicating. It isn't just a telephone fast or a telephone cheap. It's much more than that. It's the way in which we communicate with each other. And they have made, under the new commission, under Juncker's, but it was started by Barroso, a digital single market priority. It is almost the number one priority. Wouldn't believe it if you read The Journalist, because it's all about refugees, migrants, and the problems of decisions, and it's Merkel's fault, and it's a stupid Cameron in the United Kingdom doing silly things. But underneath there, the engine of the economy is still working. And it's quite interesting to see the European Union from an American point of view, who talk about the opportunities that the EU represents, which means money, it means investment. And in fact, investment is beginning to happen across Europe in quite a specific way, particularly as money is withdrawn from China, as China redresses its economy. And I want to express this through this very complicated text. And I'll try and explain it to you. Now, I've asked the organisers that everybody can have a copy of this so you can see it. This is taken from the Digital Agenda Scoreboard 2015 and the use of the internet across the European Union. I'm not talking about just Britain or Germany, where I now work. I'm talking about the whole of the EU and the 28, which is spreading for those who wish to associate with it. And what this little diagram shows is that there are 5 dimensions by which countries, comparative work, the countries in the EU, are being assessed about the new age that is being created. And they have 5. One is connectivity. So you're used to move over to digital, massively important. Your use over to broadband. I noticed yesterday when I was using my tablet in the hotel room, looking up some of the details about Serbia, 55% of your population is using the internet, 46%, this is 2014 figures, are using broadband. And with the new technology, even if you have copper wire, you don't need optical, with the new technology which is being produced, your broadband will speed up 400 times. So you can get everything off it, even though some of the technology is old. And so you have connectivity and the way in which countries are working. And you'll notice, for example, Denmark, Sweden, the Netherlands, and Belgium are very, very connected. I'll say those countries again: Denmark, Sweden, the Netherlands, and Belgium. All of them have very high GDP per capita. They're not doing this because it's there, because they have to use it to use innovation within their own societies. And that means innovating the individuals to engage with knowledge, language, information, media, if you like, which will increase their economy. It's not just economy, they're also people who are on the move. They travel the world and so do their societies. At the moment, Bulgaria, Greece and Italy are at the bottom of the list on connectivity. Italy. Why Italy? Resistance to change. It will happen under Renzi, it will have to happen, but he is resisting. It all depends upon your politicians. And of course, your politicians have a very difficult job with the pressures around them. I have huge sympathies for those who are trying to master the new technology in the 21st century. Another one, very complicated too. Next generation access. That means those, I address this to the younger members in the audience. The connectivity is going together with something which is also phenomenally happening, not only around the world, not only in Europe, but I can see from the figures from Serbia, cities are becoming massively important. You have a city of 2 million of a 7 million population. The UK has London, which has nominal population of 10 million out of 60 million, but which produces 80% of the growth of its economy. All the media companies work in London. All the international companies across Europe work in London. We have connections to the United States, and that's why we keep on winning Oscars. It's to do with the language, of course. But in many respects, it's also historical connections. But that is open to everybody in certain kind of way. And what this diagram shows, that cities are powering forward in using the digital age. And so when you're thinking about regional newspapers or regional news, what is happening? What is the structures which are going to respond to not only the digital age, but the way in which the cities themselves are beginning to respond? If I have a chance to write my second edition, this is the kind of work I'm going to try and analyze and bring new approaches to, because I think, again, it's part of the wave of change which is beginning to happen around us. Who cares? This technology. All of us should. This little diagram illustrates regular internet use across the European Union, again taken from 2015. The figures are just startling. Your consumers, your citizens, your individuals, given the chance, and the more they engage, the cheaper the price, the more they engage, the more they want to engage in the internet and everything that it responds to. Somebody said to me as we were coming down to the foyer this morning, people aren't reading newspapers anymore. I notice in the tram bus, they've all got their mobiles out. I remember going into London as a lad, and you would never see anybody on the London Underground. All you ever saw was the paper. Everybody was behind the newspaper. It's gone. Apart from the phenomenon called the free newspaper, of which I'm sure you have suffered. It's destroyed in many ways the advertising revenue that was there for the older organizations. Often it was hidden kind of where the money was coming from. It never made any money, and hence, by the way, the good news is the new digital age will get rid of free newspapers. So that will pick up some of the litter that's dropped on the floor as they are discarded. But equally, the nature of free journalism, aggregators, who doesn't read MSN News or Facebook News or Google News? And if you don't, then you're missing out on something, because all the major organizations of the media are using these aggregators. The BBC pays money to go onto MSN News. The Washington Post is paying money to go onto MSN News. And you are getting free, in relative terms for the product, high quality journalism, high quality entertainment. And now with the larger smartphones, of course, you're watching films as well as reading your news in your newspaper. And I notice that more and more when I'm in the London Underground. Some research which has just come out says that the age group of under 30 is reaching for their phone 221 times a day. How many times did everybody pick up a newspaper? 221 times a day. It's because it amalgamates. It's your friends. It's your communication network. It's talking. It's friend. She loves me. He doesn't love me. I like you. There's lots of psychological kind of things going on here with the way in which we use it. But at the same time, we're saying, oh, there's a flash. There happens to be something going on in the Maghreb. Oh, there's a crisis here. There's the 221 times. More than that, the under 35 age group is spending 5.5 hours a day on their mobiles. Don't tell their bosses, because they're doing it at work as well. Don't tell university students that that upsets academics. You're talking to a whole room. I'm looking for those at the back on their mobile. When you're talking to them and they say, you say, are you listening? And they say, yeah, of course I am. Now you go to conferences, and of course what you're doing is you're tweeting all the time, which seems kind of crazy. And then you realize your audience of 20 is actually not an audience of 20. You probably have an audience of 4,000 who are following you inside your conference. That almost every lobby group is now using these kind of techniques of communication. Is this the media? It is the media. It will be the media. And if it's not the media, it's going to touch the old media, even more so. If you think you've been through one revolution already with the end of the Cold War, we're just going to have another major technological revolution with the digital age. Now, you can suppress it. You can oppress it. They're trying to do so in China. They're trying to do so in Russia in lots of different ways. My own argument is you can build the pressure on the pressure cooker, but in the end it will burst somewhere in the way in which the consumer operates. But of course it varies from country to country, and it never will be a homogeneous world. It is not in the nature of any of us as individuals to be the same. So, the media in the digital age, from print to audiovisual, my update in 2016. I'm going into my last 5 to 7 minutes. How are the old media responding to all of this? And that is the question. Actually, more slowly than some believe. Your consumers may have left you, and they've gone somewhere else for their particular entertainment or media or news. But the organizations themselves are adapting and beginning to shift. And that means internal change, independent review of what's kind of going on, and some support from, if you like, enlightened politicians who will allow the pressures within society to allow for a new world of transparency. And by the way, I'd like to thank the work of the OSCE, who I think I am formally contracted to today. They are one of my sponsors as such. If anybody wants to really know about independent transparency, it's not about freedom of the press, because you'll never have freedom of the press. It doesn't exist. There's always different views, and there will always be pressures on what is right and wrong. But what the OSCE insists in its rules is transparency. You do your best to display for as many as you can those areas of conflict so that you can talk about it instead of killing each other about it. And I think the OSCE is a phenomenal model, and that's genuine. And to all those who work in it, well done for what you do. In very troubled times, we will need more of the OSCE in the future, and we should support it. But certainly for those in the media, the new technology is demanding adaptation and change. And this is where I'll go back to my book. Because I said in the book that you need data. You need to understand the regulation. You need to understand the differences which are associated in the different markets, whether they be public or private, in the way in which they particularly work. And there are very good sources, consultants in many ways, who are doing their work. And again, this is something that libraries can start doing in a very profound way. Instead of perhaps buying the latest books, including mine, even in the second edition, I would suggest you start moving to the data collectors and those which make the transparency available to everyone, to schools, to colleges. Surely there is a way of contracting, a way of gaining knowledge. And for example, in the media business, and I notice still my friends in media studies in the UK and Germany still do not use something like MarketLine, which is it's a consultancy group. I mentioned it in the book in 2009, and I noticed they're still continuing today. Now, I'm not going to describe the next two slides in detail, but again, these are freely available for you. But to show you the kind of analysis they do, It looks like that. In this is European newspapers in totality. I'm talking about 500 to 520 million people as a kind of market. The European Audiovisual Observatory, they've just come out with all this is freely available, by the way, this particular one, because it's just come out of the European Audiovisual Observatory. That when you look at an organization like newspapers, and almost all newspapers, there are some exceptions in Luxembourg, are private sector. That's traditionally how most of the 28 member states have worked. The private sector in newspapers. Newspapers are pushed by various things as organizations. And this includes competitor size. Who's your competitor? Who's writing what and when? All the usual stuff. Who's going to get the story first? Who is more accurate? Who is more trusted? You asked the question about, is it adaptable as an organization? Is it easy to expand it or reduce it? Are there resources for it? Is there a lack of diversity? Are there low fixed costs? Is there, how many number of players are there? Consumers, producers, journalists, and so on. This is the kind of material that must be and will be made inside the organizations. And again, you can make this transparent by making comparisons across the different countries. Other countries will be going through what you will be going through. What you will go through will be knowledge for those of us who are not here in Serbia. I'm fascinated by the program today. I really am here to not only to talk, but also to listen, to hear how you are adapting to the way in which the digital age is going to approach Serbia. And again, I've mentioned the newspapers, the question of aggregators, and the position you play. At the moment, digital newspapers are not making money. If you give them free online, they are failing. Somebody said to me yesterday, oh, I love The Guardian in the UK. It's free and it's online. Yes, they're just about to sack another load of journalists. It's losing huge amounts of money and doesn't know what to do next. It's moving to opinion rather than data. It's losing its audience. It thinks it can be populist to gain views. But there's lots of populist views. You can find them on Facebook with your friends just as much as you can from a newspaper. You've got to do value added. To my knowledge, there are 2 newspapers who are making loads of money, loads of investment, improving their journalism across the globe, and there are 2 there's one in the UK and one in America. One is the Financial Times. It has a paywall, it has a subscription, and I pay it because it's that good. It has to be that good for me to pay it. It's quite expensive. But the Washington Post is relatively cheap. It's something like €4 a month. Again, the quality of its journalism and what it offers to me for that is better than buying a newspaper. And they've worked out how to do that. They've gone for what the Americans call economies of scale. We've gone for scale. That is, widen your audience. Don't just think about nations that you're dealing with. You think about the news stories you're dealing with. Whether we like it or not, the old national borders have gone. They may put up razor wire for refugees, but you're not going to stop the global transnational nature of the digital connections unless you dig up the cables and cut them off. And if you do that, you destroy your economy for the 21st century. And that's how important it is. Now, what about broadcasting and TV publishing? Well, this was coming from 2014. And you know what? That's exactly what MarketLine does again. And again, you don't have to know the details. It breaks down how an organization works. Now, half of these are public sector organizations, and half of them are private sector organizations in the way in which they work. The internet is hitting both the old media, newspapers, private sector is hitting the public and private broadcasters enormously in the way in which they work. There was an in-joke inside the BBC, because the BBC responding to this nature of digital change, global news and local news, it's sometimes called glocal news. You put the 2 words together in the way in which it works. In talking about, they have a program called Outside Source. Now, outside source is news of the day coming from other countries or other sources, other newspapers. But the joke inside the BBC was, who's inside? as if the BBC itself is somehow located in a small planet of its own. And by the way, if you work there, it is. It's a small planet of its own, and it's finding it very difficult to change. And that's why I want to finish, not with the old, but with the new. On the left-hand side here, you'll see the four major providers of entertainment and developments that have taken the world. There's Apple, Amazon, YouTube, and at the bottom, Netflix. Look at the figures for Netflix, which started in 2009, not mentioned in my book because it wasn't there. And it's gone from $1,670 million up to a value of $4,374. In other words, it's 400% growth rate. You'll notice that Amazon is still massively important in the way in which it works. But it's the combination of these four things which is doing something which is touching the old media, the very heart of the way in which anything is produced, distributed, or consumed. It's affecting the money that's going into the business. It's diverting it, it's disrupting it, and sending it in different directions. This is taken again from the European Audiovisual Observatory, trends in ad spend by media in the EU. The top one is the green, is television. Television did not immediately lose advertising revenue across the European Union. But you'll notice by 2011, it's peaked. And by 2013, ad spend in the private sector and the public broadcasting sector has diminished on television. Why? Quite simply, 221 times a day, 5.5 hours a day on the mobile. People are going elsewhere, and the advertisers know it. The blue is as you can see there, is newspapers. Always, almost immediately affected by ad spend as soon as the digital age began to hit in, and of course, diminishing fast. So your newspapers are soon going to lose a lot of their ad revenue as this particularly begins to grow. Then you look at the red, which is magazines, who always, in a niche kind of position, have always been highly successful, more successful than newspapers in maintaining themselves as a market and providing a service, but at the same time also losing ad spend. And so has outdoor posters. Again, people are much more interested in spending their money where it can reach as many people as possible. And poor old cinema has always just kind of stayed the same, and nobody advertises very much in the cinema anymore. And of course, this thing. But there is one particular group, which is that light blue colour, and that is the internet. You can see it rising. Now, if you look at the latest, the very, very latest figures that are coming out, those trends are increasing and increasing fast. Even with the economic crisis of 2008 onwards, the internet is dominating in the way in which advertising is particularly working. And that's why there are certain issues we must deal with, and my conclusion. I still think that Michael Porter's work on thinking about the media in different forms and different dissections is still massively important. We need to do that if we're going to analyze properly. We can't just talk about the media being the media, or the journalists are the representatives of the media, because the media is wider. We need to analyze much more specifically. And certainly, I think we've got to get the power balance right between public and private. In many ways, if you look at the financial models, how money goes into public broadcasting, for example, a lot of it comes from the private sector. It's only in places like the UK and Sweden, for example, where we continue with the idea that advertising for public broadcasting on television is not allowed. Guess what people are doing? They're dropping off in their audience connections to the BBC. They're watching the shows they want to watch on their mobile, and guess what it has? It has adverts. BBC is losing revenue, public sector. You have to think that through, it seems to me. I think the old debate about public broadcasting versus private, public was bad, private was good. Public was good, private was bad. Needs rethinking in a very fundamental and profound way. You need to look at financial models and how much of the taxpayers' money you're going to use as opposed to other revenue sources. And whether there is a daily hit, for example, or subsidies, and the nature of the license fee, particularly as cities grow and where people live, and how you're going to support rural areas, and what kind of connections are you going to give regional and local news, be it newspapers, whether it be television, or whether it be an app created for the mobile that the farmer can use to see whether his crops are ready for harvesting. These are very important particular issues for the future and something I would like to do. The global media. The transnational corporations, especially digital communication companies, with the support and specialist content providers like Netflix, will increase. Netflix didn't have any money. They had an idea. If we had high-quality TV series that we will pay for the script writers, all we need to do is advertise this, and if we get enough subscribers, they will watch this. And the old media said, you must be joking. This will not happen. Who has not seen Breaking Bad? This was a TV series paid for and developed by Netflix. It won award after award after award. And it was so good, and they put the whole series up on the internet, and you could stay up all night watching it from start to finish. But it was 5 series, so you needed a week. And it was genius. And all the old people who did soap operas said, you can't do this. The audience won't do this. Yes, you can. And yes, they did. The advertising revenue was enormous. I have a confession. When I go to the TV in the evening to entertain myself, I don't turn on the BBC or the producers. I do go with them for the news. I turn on Netflix. And every night I will find something, documentary, a culture program, a history program, a fantastic film, some of the best series around. And of course the old media is trying to catch up. Has anybody seen Deutschlander 83? No? Fantastic German series just come out. Have you seen the Norwegian series called Occupied? My wife and I sit down for 3 hours at a time to watch it because it's so good. The script is fantastic. The competition and quality is driving us to Netflix. Now, you could say that's disloyal to my own national organizations. Hey, this is the world of the consumer, and it's going to become even stronger in the years ahead. No matter how much people try to oppress it or change the opinion of journalists, if journalists produce high-quality work, entertainers produce high-quality work at a reasonable price, people will buy it. Sectors and states. I've almost come to an end. I'm aware of the time. Print, radio, television, audiovisual and film. Of course, fragmentation is going to happen. My friend Mancini from Italy has been writing about this for a long time. Robert Pickard has been writing about it for a long time. André Lange has been writing about it a long time. And it will continue. You will need, all of us, we collectively, we need special skills and specialisms to use the digital age. How many of us in this room can code or even know how code is used? About time maybe we thought about it. We don't need to know completely C++ and the way in which the computer language is used, or even the new ones of HTML, HTML version 5. We don't need this. We can go to websites which will create websites for us that we can control, we can develop, we can take control of them. The European notion of the carriage of media is neutral, and access to it, as long as it's kept within ethical standards, shall be freely available to those who wish to use the network. It seems to me a very good idea. Journalism has got to change. Why am I fascinated in something happening in Washington so much? Why am I paying for the Washington Post? Why am I following the arguments of Mr. Trump in detail from an American journalist? Because that's the best place I can find it. And Mr. Trump is scary in the way in which he stands for American politics. So I need to know about this. So I don't rely upon just the UK or the BBC, which I think is considerably poor in understanding the very nature of Trump and his candidacy for the President of the United States of America. Equally, if I want to understand what President Putin is doing, I don't go to the BBC. I go to Moscow News. And I have a good look and looking and seeing what's going on. And my favorite is the Barents Observer, which the Russians tried to close down recently, and the Norwegians then created the Independent Barents Observer. Same title virtually, with the same journalists, completely independent. It seems to me one of the best online journals you can see, the Independent Barents Observer. We have to understand not only the financial models, but the sectors that go with them. We need to work with the social media, communication and networks to understand fully the way in which the media of the 21st century is going to unfold. The impact of the internet, for example. And my very last. The concerns and issues for the future is a matter of ethics. Sometimes I watch the BBC and I think I'm watching government propaganda. Now, for those of you from a Serbian audience, you say, we know about that. We know all about all those kind of things. Happens everywhere. I was sitting in France in the 1980s doing my research work and noticing how small the conversation was compared to what I was used to in the UK. I didn't know that Valéry Giscard d'Estaing was having an affair, and that he'd left the palace, and on the way back from his love affair had crashed with a milk van. I got that from the UK. It certainly didn't come from the French newspapers. Now, poor Monsieur Hollande is seen on the back of a motor bicycle, with his young actress within 24 hours. And reported in Paris Match, but not in the French newspapers because of privacy law. The world has changed around us. The question is ethics, and how do we apply them to the 21st century? If anybody's ever had a tweet conversation, you will realize how vile, how horrible some of your fellow citizens can be. They don't hold back, either in their language or their concerns, and maybe they shouldn't. If you want to go onto the Twitter space, you get ready for it and the way in which it particularly works. But for media organizations who wish to gain trust, who wish to be able to draw audiences in the way in which they used to, it seems to me they have to be independent and validated as being independent. And that's why your independent regulator is so important. If your independent regulator is not independent, you will not be independent. Now, there's not a perfect world. But that is the key to the developments in the 21st century for any society. And it's at an international, EU level, national level, and in many cases, regional as well. And once again, where there's conflict and you want to know the importance of media in it, turn to the OSCE, my sponsor, my contractor today, because they're doing such fantastic work in telling us as best as they can what's going on there. Their statute on independence for the freedom of the press is enormously good because it links into human rights as well. You've been very tolerant. I've gone on for longer than I was going to, by 7 minutes. So my apologies for the time, but thank you very much for listening.
Thank you, Professor Ruk. It's been a very comprehensive analysis of digital media. And now we are moving to the section with questions and comments. Dragi posetioci, ovo je deo gde možete postavljati svoje pitanje, dati svoje komentare, pa izvolite. Okay, maybe I can begin with the question. So, as you said, when we go online, whether we want to write a paper, whether we want to just get some news, we meet this avalanche of information. So basically, how can we keep our critical point of view?
Well, this is where the independent aggregators are so important. And again, to your right and to my left, there is the perfect independent aggregator. It's the library. You don't just go out into the cyberspace, because you will find nothing but lies, sex, dirt, terrible stories, and so on. If you're serious about using it, you need people to guide you along. And this is where organizations, including the media itself, the local newspapers, if they go online, create an online presence, will say, these are trusted sources. Instead of you writing the story about something given to you by the sources you've discovered, you allow the audience to go to the sources themselves and then begin to make up their own minds. And what you're seeing is this shift from the power of the producer and the power of the journalist into an area of trust and ethical positions where your consumer will trust you, and if you lose the trust, then of course you will lose the power of your aggregation and your ability to trust the librarian. What did you do when you walked into a library? In many ways, it's the same analogy. There are these thousands and thousands and thousands of books, and you're doing something. And of course, most students used to wander around, didn't they? Try to find the book on their own. The clever ones, us, we would say, where's the librarian? How did you categorize it? How was it? How did you judge it? What's going on? You do the same with the internet. It's not going to be anarchic for everybody, and nor should it be. It's about trust and control. And just to give a historical example, if you look at newspaper reading across Europe over the last 120 years, from the heyday of the 19th century to now, one country has one of the lower in percentage than Serbia, lowest newspaper reading audiences than anybody else. And I bet you'll never guess which country it is unless you read my book. France. If you look at the figures for France at the end of the 19th century, they were in par with everybody else reading newspapers. The First World War came along, and the government took over the media, newspapers, and it lied. The brothers, the fathers, the grandfathers, the cousins didn't come back from the trenches. But they were constantly saying, we're winning the war, we're going to do this. And you see immediately after the First World War, the number of audience figures drops enormously. And then you see it slowly in the 1930s rising again in France. And then guess what happens? The Second World War. And what does Vichy France do? It takes over the complete sense of the media, film, radio, and so on, under the Nazis. And it lied. The audience has never come back in France. The skepticism culturally inside the French. The French, if you ask a French person in the domesticity of their own home, do you trust a politician? Never. Do you trust a journalist? Never. Do you read it? Not much. What do you watch on the news? Very little, but I like the sport. A very interesting analogy from the past. If a society loses its trust with its communication organizations, then you will end up with a lot of skepticism about the nature of change and what's going on.
Thank you. Da li neko želi da postavi pitanje?
Talk to me.
Okay. Then I have another one. Maybe you can... okay, sorry. Izvolite.
Dobar dan. Dobar dan, ja sam Zoran Gavrilović iz Biroa za društveno istraživanja. Ono što mene interesuje jeste cenzura u digitalnom dobu. Kako ona funkcioniše, da li ima, da li se razlikuje. Mi imamo veliku debatu ovdje u Srbiji jer prosto postoje neki nalazi koji govore o tome da možda nemamo cenzuru, ali da je cenzorski ambijent i volio bi da je ovdje s nama danas neko iz Saveta za borbu protiv korupcije koji je izdao jedan sjajan izveštaj pre nekih mjesec dana. Prosto znači interesuje me vaše iskustvo i vaše, odnosno da li ste se bavili time i vaši nalazi.
Yes, I have, and last year I published a paper which to a certain extent, which dealt with these particular issues. I won't refer to Serbia because I don't know enough, and I think that would be wrong for me to do so. Yes, censorship has always applied in the media, and to think that it's just a new phenomenon, of course, would be wrong. This goes back to the very formation of newspapers in the 17th century, in which they included a stamp tax, which was a tax on the publication and so on. And it wasn't for the money, it was for control and licensing. So licensing has always been a form of control. Now, censorship means stopping someone doing something. I'll give the Chinese example because it's phenomenally intricate. Because you read most journalists writing about China, where they say the internet, for example, is being curbed, which is being censored. There's some very latest work just come out of Harvard by a professor there who has proven this not to be the case. In fact, in China, the Chinese response to the internet is positive. They wish to have as many individuals innovating and communicating as possible. There are only two things that the Chinese actually censor. First is pornographic sites, sex. The Chinese Communist Party doesn't like sex, certainly on the internet. The biggest breaking of the censorship by using different forms of the internet, and what the audience in China is using, 1 in 4 clicks in China is to do with sex and pornography, with the censorship or not. The very nature of the internet itself will allow that comment to go. And you either oppress everybody and kill the society, or you try to oppress the producers of the news or the concerns, which some people are still trying to do. But do you think the audiences are going to listen? They're talking to each other anyway, and they're crossing borders. Now, what are you going to do? Cut the cable, cut the wire? So censorship is actually quite difficult. Self-censorship is another matter. Fear. Why do journalists get killed? It's not just the individual journalist. It's to create fear. Fear in society. You can't take them on. You can't challenge and that kind of stuff. Well, if your local journalists get killed, there are loads of other journalists who are now writing about you and your society outside, and that is freely available. In Russia, of course, most of the internet, again, is completely, and they don't control pornography in Russia, which is quite interesting. But they do control, as the Chinese do, conspiracies which may threaten the state. Now, the states have always done that, and it's a matter of degree. The trouble is, it seems to me, and I say this with my wife in mind, where we often talked about how we couldn't get certain stories on the BBC, we couldn't do this, a sort of form of censorship, and we complain bitterly about some of the content at the present time. Us in the media, we in the media, think we have more power than we think we have. And we've kind of exaggerated ourselves. Ultimately, if censorship is occurring in society, it's because probably your politicians are oppressing the society as a whole. And the media is a part of that kind of process. So in the end, it's your constitutional arrangements, your independence as a media organization, if you can create one, a reviewer, which is going to solve that problem. But will it ever go away? No. It's always a pressure for the truth and honesty. And that's why I don't use those words anymore. I use transparency. I don't know whether I've answered your question, but that's my reply anyway. Thank you.
Hvala vam. Još pitanja? Neki komentari koje biste voljeli da podelite sa nama? Well, my second question actually deals with the things that this gentleman asked you. It is about disruption that exists between the old media and the digital media, basically the kind of information that we get from both of them, especially dealing with the political situation where we have this very strong political propaganda in the old media and this very strong, well, let's say anti-political propaganda criticizing the government and ministers in the digital media. So basically people are starting to lose their common sense, who to believe, what to trust. And I was actually going to ask you, as you said, you didn't want to comment the situation in Serbia because you don't know about it that much. But do you know of any other cases similar to this one?
I think almost all countries in the European Union have gone through some forms of censorship. The experience that is learnt between them, and that's why I'm a great advocate of comparative work, is those societies which are freer than those which are more oppressed or censored are more dynamic, more innovative, happier, more engaged with politics in some kind of way. Now, of course, some politicians wish to be autocratic and to tell us what is the particular truth. There are some media editors, press editors, who also want to tell me how to think and what is the truth. And this comes down to this question of trust, which comes from society and the relationship between you, the producer of a text, and the person who consumes it. Who ultimately should choose the facts and the figures? And this is where independence of data is very important. Again, 2 years ago, I wrote a paper about the importance of data journalism. There's a lot of things wrong with data journalism. You can skew things through using statistics. But those who lie can often be picked up very quickly. And there are cases in South America, in the United States, in Africa, all over the world, and in China, where data journalism has exposed wrongdoing and the lies associated with it. Now, if your competitor, say you're an old newspaper fighting another newspaper, and they have used one sense of the truth and you think it's another, prove yourself. Use the data. It isn't about rhetoric anymore. We're all full of opinions. Me, myself, probably most of all. So it has to be reflected in some form of reality. So this is a cultural journalistic shift in the way you see knowledge and how you report it. And that way you can combat those who lie or those who are trying to hide the access to the sources of knowledge you're looking for.
Thank you. Možda ste sada došli na ideju šta vas zanima da čujete. Mikrofon samo ako može.
Thank you, colleague.
Već sam jednom na sličnim skupovima pričao o istoj stvari, ali htio bih da kažem pre 10 godina, 96. sa jednom grupom urednika od 2006. pardon. Sa jednom grupom urednika boravili smo u Americi jedno 5-6 dana i posjetili smo nekoliko medija. U Washington Postu su nam objašnjavali kako im je pao tiraž, ali kako su nikad čitaniji njihovi sadržaji na internetu. I pitali su nas odavde, imate neku ideju kako da prodamo to na internetu, kako da zaradimo pare na internetu. Istovremeno posjetili smo i YouTube. Tamo su, sve je rastuće naravno, i tamo su nam rekli da oni ipak vapiju za sadržajima klasičnih medija, za ozbiljnim sadržajima klasičnih medija, da su ti sadržaji jako važni. Dakle, koliko se od tada, da li se od tada nešto promenilo u smislu ekonomskih uslova za proizvodnju ozbiljnih sadržaja? Dakle, svetu su, društvima, civilizaciji su nužni ozbiljni sadržaji. Dakle, pitanje je izvor novca i da li je moguće na tome zaraditi na tržištu, koliko su se stvari po vama promenile u međuvremenu, dakle u ovih 10 godina, ja od tada nisam bio na polju. Hvala.
The evidence so far is mixed. But the truth is, yes, you can. And that's why I used the examples of Washington Post and the Financial Times. Both of them decided to ask for a paid subscription. And they then became very sensitive and aware that they could produce online and have a wider audience. And that is by widening the audience itself to the people who used to read the Washington Post. It's quite amusing to read it on a daily basis, because if you go to the latter sections, there's quite good sport still. So it's very American. You even have the deaths of notable people in Washington, which for me as a UK reader, I find bizarre, because the UK newspapers stopped doing this decades ago, putting in memoriam kind of pictures. But it gives a sense of kind of community. But I have decided personally to buy the Washington Post because of the presidential election. And I'm not going to get anything better than the Washington Post to do it. But I'm not alone. They have now beaten the New York Times, who is also making money online by having a subscription. Both the New York Times and the Washington Post have widened the scale. And what they do is much more international news. They have much more international people reading their newspapers. The Financial Times is another example of high success. Not only is the graphics fantastic, the data available to me phenomenal. It has a pluralistic approach. I have left-wing thoughts in it as well as right-wing. I have neutral, I have central, I have professionals, I have skills, I have culture, and so on. It has a whole range. But most important, of course, is that it's giving me something I can't really find anywhere else. But it's not just me and my responses to it. 66% of the Financial Times subscribers are international engagers. So if you're looking locally and whatever, you do have to do that market line exercise of saying, what's my audience, how much money, will they pay for it, can they find it somewhere else? And that's what is pushing the aggregators in some kind of ways. Now, places like Sweden, for example, which started the free newspaper, they're also moving to free, if you like, local news online. Because although the great global events of the year and national events are so important, local news still has a market. So what they're doing is they're coming together as different newspapers, making an online presence where they share resources. They share broadband width and depth. They share stories, which I think is important for their own area. I used to live in a very small village of something like 15,000 people called Faversham. I still read its news, and it connects to all the local other villages. And then it goes up to another layer, and I can see the county administrative area in which it's working. As I understand it, they are making money, but their figures are not transparent. It's a mixture of both. It is a mixture of both. And of course, this is why I was trying to, maybe badly, but try to illustrate that what happens in the retail industry and the advertisers is very important for the media. And if they're all going to cities, and if they're all going to Amazon, what's happening to the local retailer? So what's happening is that you're beginning to find aggregators which say, you want a good plumber in this area? Then we have actually got 1,000 reviews from people who've used the plumbers. And so suddenly you've got a kind of hierarchy of it. It isn't an anarchy to find any plumber. And anyway, in the UK, they're all Polish, by the way. We always have a joke about the Polish plumber in the UK. Remember that our migration over the last 5 years has been enormous. We've gone from a population of 61 million to 66 million. Often forgotten in the journalism, where that's why the UK doesn't want to take any more Serbians and so on, any more Syrians and so on, and that kind of thing. There are means by doing it. Often it's associated with creating an app, because it won't be just your laptop or your computer. It'll be the app that attracts people in the way in which it works. But it is difficult. In the end, you're looking for Amazon, Google, to move down into the local and begin to invest. And they will, because they are so rich. They're doing it in film, disrupting the whole of the film industry because of the nature of the way in which they work. The future power of the telecommunications industries, instead of going off to your local baron who will give you money to support what he thinks ought to be in the newspaper, nowadays, of course, you use other means for finding your resources. It is there, but it's difficult. It won't all be free. But that's why the public broadcasting system and the use of valid taxpayers' money is so crucial. You're not talking about soap powder, important though that is. You're talking about the very nature of the way in which we communicate and how we trust. And again, that's where public broadcasting, if it's independent enough and has enough trust, for example, one last one, Germany. Germans read more newspapers than anybody else in the whole of Europe. They still do. They read more books than anybody else, and they still do. Librarians are still full, and they have money, and that's being kind of provided. Equally, they're regional, they're Länder, because the German system is different. It's not organized federally, it's organized by regions. They all have their own TV and broadcasting. All of them are moving online as a supplement, and all of them are being watched. So when you see the figures from Germany, you will see that their audience, their subscribers, their license fee payers trust the Germans very much. There's a little story in Der Spiegel last week, in fact it was on Monday, which said, of course, that because of the migrant case and because of the Bavarian Prime Minister, they're criticizing this, the media at the present time, and there's a lack of trust. But overall, if you look at the figures, it's not true. It varies from society to society. And we as analysts say, well, why? What's going on? And often it is about this trust and having the models make it work. I hope that answers the question. Good question.
Thank you. Ima li još pitanja? Ukoliko ne, pozivam vas na 15-minutnu pauzu za kafu, nakon koje ćemo se ponovo naći ovde. Očekuje nas panel diskusija, gde ćemo razgovarati o medijskoj praksi u Srbiji sa političkog, zakonodavnog i tehnološkog aspekta. Hvala vam.
Thank you, translator.